Does.
Welcome to everybody who's just jumping on. Appreciate you all. We're gonna get started in about 3 to 4 minutes, just to allow a few more people to get on here, and then we'll get rolling.
Just got to reposition.
And I see we just had a few more people jump on, just to let you know we're gonna get started in a couple minutes. We just want to give a few more minutes for more people to be able to come on. But thank you all for joining though. All right, Elijah, are you ready? All right, get rolling.
Welcome, friends. My name is Elijah Juan McCagney. I use he and they series pronouns, representing Nazareth College as the Assistant Vice President for Inclusion, Diversity, and Educational Achievement. And my colleague.
How's it going? Herb Alexander. I am the Chief Diversity Officer and Associate Dean of Students at Roberts Wesleyan College, and we just appreciate everyone being here.
Yes, friends, welcome. So today's session is entitled The Pain and Privilege of Being Professionally Woke. And this is the first of many in a collaborative effort for WNDO. So I'll give a little brief background on WNDO. So WNDO stands for Western New York Diversity Officers. So we're a cohort or consortium, if you will, of various diversity officers across Western New York. And our goal was to create a series, which we're calling Inclusive Intersectional Insights, that allows you literally a window into what it's like for diversity officers in our roles, and also sort of humanize us in terms of what we do and what we offer in our profession, as well as how we show up personally in our roles.
Yeah, thank you for that, Elijah. So yeah, appreciate just that background on WNDO and the things that we do. So I'm just going to give some quick format and set the stage for how tonight is going to go. But before I do that, I just want to take this time to shout out a few folks at Roberts who helped push the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion who don't get enough recognition. And so on this platform, we have over 70 people here today, which is good. I just want to shout them out. So first, the staff diversity committee who helps kind of guide direction and thought for the Office of D&E. Appreciate everyone who's involved in that. Our academic diversity committee, which is headed by Julie Grimm and also Linda McQuillan. They do a great job as far as making sure diversity is infused in the curriculum. And then lastly, our college resource group for race and ethnicity, or the longest acronym on the planet, CRGRE. We appreciate our two co-chairs of that, Dr. Benjamin Espinoza and Dr. Sinet Bosco. They do a great job. And then of course, our leadership from the President's Cabinet who pushes forward diversity. So just wanted to make sure I shouted you all out because you all deserve it. So today, how today is gonna roll, Olajuwon and I will start off giving some context to this topic, the pain and privilege of being professionally woke. So we'll talk through just those concepts. Right after that, we'll get into the actual panel discussion. You see we have a star-studded lineup, folks here today, All-Star crew. They'll be giving us their thoughtful insights on some questions that they received before today, so they can really think of some thoughtful answers and we can really get some good inclusive insights. And by the way, as we do that, we encourage you all to please, please, please use the Q&A. So if you look down at the bottom of your screen, I think for most of us, the chat feature isn't enabled, but the Q&A feature is. And so as people are answering questions, and if you hear something that really, really captures your attention and you want to hear more about that, right then and there, please put that into the Q&A. We ask that our panelists don't respond to that right then and there, or don't type in the answer. We'll save it for our next section, which is the Q&A section. But the worst thing could be you have a great question and you forget it, and then you miss the chance to get some education, or maybe somebody else had a similar question to educate. And so Olajuwon and I will ask some questions of our panelists. As we go through, we will do some follow-up questions if there's things that we think we could respond upon a little bit more. And then once we get done with that, we'll flow into our Q&A section. And so we will be recording the first half, but the Q&A piece, which will be about 30 minutes, we won't record that part, just so people can be encouraged to ask really the questions that they have on their heart. So that's how it's going to go. And so I'll pass it back to Olajuwon.
Thank you. So first, we want to just introduce you to our panelists. Our panelists will expound on their roles, but we just want to take an opportunity to amplify them. So we welcome our first panelist, Dr. Calvin Gant, who is the Chief Diversity Officer of Monroe Community College. I'm sorry, that pause was like, I don't know if we're going back and forth, sorry. So I'll go to our next panelist is Dr. Tamika Wagstaff, AVP for Academic Access and Success for RIT. And our last panelist is Dr. Khorram Hussain, Vice President for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. Welcome, welcome panelists. And before we dive into our panel discussion, as Herb alluded to, we're gonna sort of ground our conversation so that we have a shared understanding on what we mean by woke. For some of you, you're probably asking, what does woke actually mean? So this is one of my favorite quotes by Zora Neale Hurston. And the quote is, if you're unable to read, it says, "If you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it." Now, this may not in higher ed land a literal death, but it actually could be that they can kill you with shame. They can kill you with guilt. They can kill you with judgment. And you participate in. And then when you speak your truth about your trauma or your pain professionally, there's often no space to be seen or heard. So think about that as we have this conversation and dialogue. So that concept of wokeness, friends, it's often like a state of being, but what I want you to hone in on is the fact that this concept of wokeness places sort of unachievable benchmark, if you will, on educating oneself about the injustices around the world. It makes people feel as if they accomplished something, like they're earning a title because I am woke. But there's always more to be done and more to learn. So no one is really ever truly woke. And a lot of people wear this term woke as like a proverbial badge of honor. You'll see this in a lot in allyship situations to show the world that they're safe and there's nothing to worry about, which can actually hurt, especially when you commit an act of injustice. We think about this whole world of the cancel culture. Imagine being that woke person and you make a mistake. Who do you lean on to? Who do you lean into? If you're not allowed to make a mistake, you're not allowed to be human. That's what we want you to start to think about in that role from a lens of there's no opportunity to sit in comfort. A lot of the time as a diversity officer or professional at institutions of higher education, that second to last bullet, it's terrifying, it's isolating, it's lonely, because sometimes you're the only knower, or sometimes your identity is used as a skill set. Sometimes you're thinking about ways of how can I show up and be my whole self but also in being my whole self, myself is political. And how do you manage that in those professional spaces?
Yeah, appreciate that, starting off that concept. And so here are just some of the unhelpful habits that go around with being woke or wokeness. And so the first is you can begin to start to call people out, right, in unhelpful ways. So ways that aren't constructive criticism, but really destructive criticism. And so once you really get into this space of being woke, it's really like a transformation. And I can remember mine, it was back in 2013 when I started getting into that space of being woke. And you can really begin to have a superiority mindset in that. And so that can be one of the main helpful habits to wokeness. And then the reason why that is, or the things that can happen from that, is you can forget to check your, or I love this parenthesis here, our privilege, right? And so realizing that the access that we have been afforded, especially us in a higher education setting where we know only 36% of folks get a bachelor's degree, under 15% get a master's. And I'm not even sure of the doctor level, but I know it's definitely pretty small. Have access to the education that we get. And so if we don't check our privilege, it's easy to do some of the same things that as diversity officers or people who are really conscious about diversity, equity, inclusion, it's easy to do the same thing that we're trying to prevent others from doing. And so that can also lead to judging others who don't think like us, right? Which is similar to the types of bias we're familiar with, the affinity bias, people you're aligned with who think like you, and then you then to exalt yourselves and discount the others. Comparison bias, right? Where you compare where you are to people within who aren't where you are, and oftentimes they were in your own or same group, right? And then from that though, this fourth bullet, looking down on less woke folk, that is really a result of the first three bullets, right? And so you call out people in unhelpful ways, you forget to check your privilege, you judge others, and so that all leads to looking down on people who are not where you are. And that is not the goal or the outcome of wokeness. And then the last piece, and Elijah wanted to touch on this in a great way, is when you're woke, you can pretend like you don't have more growing to do, right? It's easy to see wokeness as a destination and not a journey, right? And so when you get to this space, it's easy to just land and stay stuck and stay complacent where you are. And if I'm really thinking about it, I think woke is not just a state of knowing, but it's a state in knowing that there's a lot more to know, right? And so once you realize that you have access to more information, once you become woke, you realize that you have a lot more to do and a lot more space to grow.
Thank you so much, Herb. I think the next point that we want to make is that there's plight in that positionality of being woke and also being a diversity officer. And we took the liberty of dividing it up to the section. So thinking about being woke and then being a diversity officer at an institution, you are negotiating at the margins. So when I say negotiating at the margins, is that most diversity officers are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. So it's always negotiating at the margins in terms of, it's a paradox of what we allow or what is most visible. So often we're navigating higher education and we're only being seen through our lens of Blackness and brownness. Also, in only being seen through being Black or brown, it's often stigmatizes our leadership style or our development, because it's often seen only through the guise of our race or ethnicity. There's a negotiating at the intersection. So not only that we're often only seen via Black and brown, our other identities are lost. So as our Black and brownness intersects with our age, or our spirituality and religion, or our sexuality, or our gender identity and expression, it gets lost, but also it gets manipulated, it gets exploited, it gets co-opted. And what I have here is commoditized as social currency. So oftentimes as a diversity officer, and in your BIPOC, you can often be tokenized as a bridge to BIPOC culture or to language at the erasure of your other intersecting identities. Oftentimes, your leadership style becomes racialized. And at the unfortunateness of your other identities. And that's what we talked about politics of negotiating spaces, that you're often trying to negotiate the terrain, not only thinking about the hierarchies of your institution, but you're often your spheres of influence, your rings of influence at the intersections, at the margins, but also just in being mindful is that we're navigating these spaces that are often operating on colonial or white supremacist guidelines. So there's that thing that we don't talk about, but that we're often going up against in our roles.
Perfect. All right, so we hope that that provided really the context and set the stage for our discussion. And now we get to the moment everyone's been waiting for here for our all-star panel. And so I'm actually going to start with Calvin with this. And so just the context to this first piece, you think about the pain and privilege of being professionally woke. So from the lens of pain, there's been an increased awareness on race, injustice, and the need for equity in our country, especially many people have already had that, but especially in this last 6 to 8 months or so, right? So unfortunately, that has come on a catalyst of, or the catalyst of this awareness has come from or come on the heels of many traumatic events. So just a few examples would be George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Daniel Plouffe, Jacob Blake. It's many people we can go down the list and talk about. And so with that in mind, and I'll go to Calvin first, can you take us through the challenge and pain associated with being personally affected by these tragic events, but also being asked or required to be the person that educates or heals others in the midst of that turmoil?
All right, so thank you. You came to me first, and this was probably for me the hardest of the 4 questions for me to respond to. So I'm going to try to keep it within my time limit and talk from that perspective. So for me, I've been in higher ed now going almost 25 years. And so serving in the Chief Diversity Officer role at MCC as their inaugural Chief Diversity Officer has been an interesting experience for me, especially during this specific time in our country's history. So I'll tell you why all of the things in the country hit me the way that they did. And what'll be interesting is that this is to be the first time as a professional I've talked about these intersectionalities in any kind of meeting situation. So, you know, thinking about it, for me, it was kind of like the perfect storm, or I call it the trifecta of situations. So we're dealing with certainly me being a Black male and watching, you know, the death play out on television. not once, not twice, but over and over and over and over in a loop as well. Um, the second part of that is being a gay Black male and also being in an interracial relationship for more than 20 years. So all of that played out in March in a variety of different ways for me. And so having all of those intersectional things happening, taking place at one time, I thought from a professional standpoint, I had already addressed all of these things. I had moved beyond that. But seeing all of this play out the way that it did in March brought back for me that I have not really addressed all of the different intersectionalities in the same way. And they haven't all been a major part of my professional work. And so that was a wake up call, really, for me to think about that and to take a step back. And I've spent a lot of time, a lot of internal reflection time, and thinking about things that weren't hitting the news. We weren't talking about the fact that police brutality for Black trans women was at an all-time high. That never really made the news very much. We weren't talking about the fact that hundreds and hundreds of women from indigenous populations and Native American women from their reservations were being killed and disappearing, and no one spoke of it. So we weren't talking about those things the same way we were about some of the other issues that were taking place in the country. So again, for me, it was a lot to take in mentally and to know that all of these things are happening, but to not want to take away from the movement, but to also want to say to people, but there's a lot of other pain going on during this movement as well that's not receiving the same kind of attention without being put in a box saying, oh, you're against this or you're anti this. And so it's playing a really hard role in juggling all of those different things in one's head and trying to figure out, okay, and now also I have to try to work with my campus and be the voice. And so that was difficult, really difficult for me to the point where, some of but most people on campus may have noticed as well. I started to an email and on Zoom calls, I had to start saying to people, I'm not okay because people weren't asking. No one was asking whether I was okay. So I had to start offering it up as a point of knowledge for people to know that whatever we're discussing on this call today is fine, but I need you to know that I'm not okay, and so I may not be my authentic, genuine self throughout this conversation. So those were some of the things that came up for me during that time and trying to navigate that space.
Yeah, I love that answer in general. And I just want to follow up on something you said. And before I do that, I just want to encourage everyone that if you have questions, please log into the Q&A if you didn't hear that, and just write your question there. We'll get to those a little bit later. But just that last part about before you were able, or what you had to do in your email, or you had to do before you started the conversation, is let people know, I'm not okay. Right. I think that takes a lot of courage, first of all, because I think many of us felt that way, but may not have had the courage to say that in fear of how our colleagues will respond or our supervisor will respond and what have you. So first, how did people respond? And then how did you navigate those responses? Because I think that is that's powerful.
Well, I mean, I think initially when people would see it, it would catch people off guard. It's similar to, there's a counseling technique that you use that if someone says something and you just say, ouch, just by the virtue of using the word ouch, it stops people long enough to be like, wait a minute, he just said ouch. What is the ouch about? And so I think when people initially saw that, it was kind of like, wow, I know him and I know him to be a professional and I know his work ethic, but I wasn't giving him the space to be able to feel his way through this experience. And so again, as Olajuwon mentioned, when you're in these roles and in this work, people sometimes forget that you are your individual self first. You are your job second to that. And so you have to sometimes remind people of that.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And, I want to go from there to Tamika. Could you just follow up? Same question to you.
Yeah. I think like Calvin said, it brings a lot of things to the surface, and it's difficult to kind of manage. It's like when you're trying to manage your work-life balance, but now you're trying to manage just the world, work, home, everything. So for me, I normally am the voice for our students. So it's hard to balance wanting to support, be there for them, having your own feelings, and knowing that you also are the voice of a division and you represent an institution as well. Um, but like Kelvin, I started going to Zoom meetings and my camera would be off. I actually had to speak up on some meetings and just say, it's so great that everybody is laughing and smiling. You just, life is just wonderful in your world, right? Like nothing is happening right now. Um, and then you become the person that everybody is turning to. All of the colleges, all of the divisions are calling you because they want you to come. Can you talk to our staff? Can you talk to us about how we should be helping the students and about how we should be doing this? And at some point, it was like, no. I mean, I'm sure there are other people who are more than willing to come in and be an active participant in this conversation. But for me right now, I've had enough of the conversation and I need to step back a little bit for myself. Um, and some people are open to receiving that and understand, and other people take it as an ouch, like Kelvin said, like they look at it in a different point of view. I think I've um, been blessed in having a supervisor and having an environment where I can be my authentic self. So most people know that 99% of the time that I'm going to say truly how I'm feeling and what I'm going through and what I need and what I don't need. Um, Especially when it comes to our students. So making sure that I was sending a message to our students that said, I see you, I hear you, I stand with you. I'm feeling the same exact pain that you're feeling, and I understand that you're upset. And having the freedom to be able to do that and to voice my concern and to voice my support for them was really important, because the students are looking for, yes, a message that's going to come from the president that speaks to things that presidents speak to, but they also want a message that's going to speak directly to them, and that is a voice that understands, that stands with them and walks with them. And so being able to have that opportunity, I think also helped me work through it, because I know that, yes, I have all these things that I'm carrying. I love Black men. All the men in my life that I love and that matter to me are Black men. I'm raising a Black son. So it is hard to watch all of these things, but also as a Black woman, it's hard because a lot of times we carry all of the weight, and we're the ones standing on the front lines, and we're the ones, that are trying to protect and that are trying to hold our families together and that are trying to make sure that we still can walk in and go to work every day and do all those things. So there's also that fatigue that comes with the movement and that comes with everything that's happening. So also trying to recenter and having some self-care in the process as well.
Yeah, I love that. And Zoom, they don't have my reactions at the bottom. I would have had the Black clapping hands while you was going through that for sure. No, thank you, Olajuwon. Did the genius? That's the organic Black clapping hands. But so to that question, just to follow up, and I can imagine with the intersectionality of being Black and being a woman, and I know women like emotion in the workplace, like the same way Calvin had the "I'm not okay," which was I think that was courageous, right? As also being a woman in that space, I can imagine if you were to show emotions or to say "I'm not okay," that might be viewed differently, just because of our societal expectations or how women are supposed to be in the workplace. But I did have one quick follow-up question, then I go down to Kurum to go ahead and ask you the same question. But do you ever feel the burden that, yes, you are not okay and you need time for self-care, but you might actually be the best person to educate the folks there, right? You might actually be the best person to do that.
Yes, sometimes I do. And it can be hard to say no. It can be hard to step away or hard to find the balance. So what I've tried to do is I call it friends raising and finding those collaborators and partners and kind of building that coalition of people. So when I do feel like I've been overburdened or I need to, this conversation may not be the one for me, that I have other people that I trust and I can go to say, would you mind stepping in? Or would you even mind having the conversation and being there with me? So if there's a moment that comes and I need to just, fade to black in that conversation, that you're able to jump to the forefront and kind of pick it up and go.
Great, thank you. Okay, now I'll come down to Karam, have you answer the same question. For folks who may have forgot the original question, just really quick, they're just taking us through the challenge and pain associated with being personally affected by the tragic events that are happening in our society, but also being the one asked to educate or heal others. And so, Karam, I ask you the same question.
Thank you, and thank you, Calvin, Tamika, for bearing witness. You know, the power of your honesty. I feel like there's a kind of healing in just bearing witness to what you all shared. So I'm grateful, and I'm glad all of us got to hear that. I actually, when I think about pain in education and the life of a professional, for me, I want to go back and frame this a little bit 20 years ago. I was a school teacher before I was a professor. I was a school teacher in New York, so I'm loving Calvin's art in the background there. And I was a school teacher when the World Trade Center was hit, and it was close enough that ash and everything billowed into the school. It was a profound moment of trauma and crisis. It was also a profound moment of vulnerability. Where everything kind of became flat for a moment. People became just people, professors, teachers, students, staff, everybody was in tears and with each other. And I also saw that community then come back into a world that went from mourning and tragedy to white lash and imperialism. It went to a war on terror and waterboarding and imperial conquest. And as a school teacher, I wanted to work with my students on being critical thinkers, looking at what this all meant. But as a member of a community, I felt alone. And I remember at one of these daily gatherings that we had at the school would get together before the day started. So people would talk about lost family members and just the trauma of that moment. And, I had a teacher push me to get up and speak. And I did speak, and I bore witness really for the first time at a school I'd only worked at for about a week when the attacks had happened. And the power and the pain of bearing witness to being a brown-skinned Muslim man that felt hunted, and the call to community that I could make from that place, that it was the authority of my suffering that gave people pause about some of their own unmitigated and kind of reactionary attitudes of Islamophobia. The reason I bring this up, even though it was 20 years ago and some people on the call might not have been alive then, is that there's a way in which three things emerged for me that were very important in the years after that. And certainly in a position that I literally started 1 week after George Floyd was murdered. And those three things came up all over again, the same as they did in the years after 9/11. The first was vulnerability, that I have to be able to be vulnerable, that's actually where my power is. I don't have a lot of other power in this world, but I have the power to walk towards the uncertainty of bearing witness. I also have to be able to say, nobody's coming. Nobody's coming to save us. Because that's what I was washed over with after 9/11. And that's what I was washed over with when I watched Philando Castile murdered. That's what I was washed over with when I saw George Floyd. Nobody is coming. Nobody is coming to help us. Nobody's coming to save us, except for the communities that we build. It is that which we are required to do. And that is where the last lesson comes in. And that is the power to be educators, the healing power that comes from being educators, the sacred opportunity we have to work in institutions of learning at moments of great moral and political crisis. And some of us, so many of us, exist permanently and perpetually in that state of crisis, in that state of trauma, in that state of nobody is coming. And so when I started that work, I started it with that. I started it with the aspiration of connecting community activists with faculty and saying, why don't we do a series of teach-ins together? Why don't we start looking at the ways in which this moment actually provides more opportunity to get people to pay attention to the historic and enduring forms of inequity that our institution has blithely kind of just walked past. And let's all learn in this moment. Let's all teach in this moment. And I won't say or lie or pretend, after all the authentic things that have already been said, that I have come out of this process healed and better. I will say that those three things, though, are the things that are keeping me together in a professional context. That capacity to be vulnerable, that seeking of true community, and that work of educating. And in my professional life, I've never had to hold more firmly to those to keep myself afloat.
Yeah, thank you, Kermit. Really powerful stuff. And I think what really resonated with me was that just there's power in vulnerability, right? Like bearing witness to your story and what you're going through. Similar to what everyone here has already said, and what we're doing right now is being vulnerable and using some of our power, power based on what you're saying. So I love that. Thank you. I know we went a little bit over time there, so Elijah, I'll pass it back to you to share our screen and talk about the next question.
Oh, no worries. We're having some good dialogue. So I appreciate this. I think like Quorum, you are like talking like my language in terms of like some things are not in our locus of control as educators. Like we can't control the historical and the systemic harm, but we can control how we reconcile the spiritual, the emotional, the communal damage that harm brings to our institutions. So I'm just gonna share for you our next slide. So our first theme was talking about pain, now we're talking about the privilege. So to ground our conversation, the context is along with pain, being professionally woke also has some privilege associated with it. Being professionally woke, because of our education, experiences, or daily work, affords us insights and understandings that many of our people do not have. This allows us to speak, act, and exist in certain spaces that most people cannot or do not. So the question that we're proposing for the group is, the privilege that we have can often lead to a disconnect between us and many of the people within our community because how we are viewed, and can lead to a sense of distrust. How can we navigate this and unify that sense of separation? And I'll hand it over to you, Calvin, and I'm going to stop my screen from sharing 1 second.
Okay, well, again, y'all didn't ask us any easy questions tonight. So I just want to make sure that we point that out to the audience, that none of these questions are questions that we would expect any individual to just be like, oh, I have the epiphany answer to that. So just know that it's coming from a place of love. And I know that our facilitators chose the questions the way that they did. So, and I know I saw something very similar in one of the chat questions. So how do you build that trust within the community? Well, that's the first thing, is how connected are you to the community? What efforts do you make to try to connect to the community in a variety of different ways? Some of that, of course, has to do with your own personal background and your own lived experience while in the community. And also perhaps some of the traumas you may have experienced while in the community, and that may or may not have been addressed or dealt with. So again, in these spaces, you have to be able to be authentic when you walk in and say, I don't know everything that's going on in the community, especially if I'm not living right in the heart of the community, and be able to say that to people. It's like, but I'm here to listen. I'm here to be able to offer whatever support and assistance that I can. And I vow to come back and continue to have the discussion because all too often, and I remember this in my own days in the South Bronx, you would get someone to come in and speak to you once, and then you never saw that person again. And so you can't create any authenticity with people if they come and share their story or their message once, and then that's it. And you never have an opportunity to reconnect with those individuals. So so that's part of it, and you got to be able to and willing to go to people where they live. It's not the same inviting people from the community to MCC. That's not the same as going to the community and talking to the community about MCC and what you think MCC and how you think it can help you. And I think sometimes we get those messages mixed up because we have something that people want or need. They need that education, they need that certificate, they need that degree, but we forget that we need them to actually take advantage of those things. Because if they don't take advantage of those things, then we just have it and it's available. So spending some time really just thinking about how you want to have that conversation and how you want to message. Oftentimes, you want to connect with somebody who is in the community because they have that authenticity. And if you go to the community with that individual, you will be accepted in a very different way, maybe than if you just walked into the community yourself. And I'm saying that about all people. That's black, white, brown, it doesn't matter. Depending on what cachet you have in that community, you need to be make sure you're connecting with people that are a part of that community. Otherwise, you're just seen as another voice, and so you have to be a little bit mindful of those things.
Thank you. Calvin, in the spirit of time, we're going to go right into a response from Tamika.
Like Calvin said, being your true authentic self. I think for me, what I try and do is through different organizations and things that I'm a part of, being in the community, doing community service, as a professional from RIT, and then just as me, Tamika, the person. So I think that helps to connect with the community when you really are there, you're meeting them where they are. And even when I'm not there in with my RIT hat on, I'm still talking about RIT and I'm still talking about what we have to offer. But when I'm talking to students, I always tell them the students that RIT is trying to recruit, and especially if you're an underrepresented student, there's probably 50 other RIT caliber schools trying to recruit you too. So this may be what makes us different. But I give the same message to RIT when I'm talking to admissions, when I'm talking to our vice presidents, I'm saying, those underrepresented students that we're trying to attract, there are 50 other places that they could go. They may be able to get a free ride at MIT or at RPI. So we have to make sure that we're doing different things, that we're creating a culture and climate and community on campus that is able to reflect where they may be coming from or the things that are important to them or things that they can connect with. So I think it's really about being who you are, but also being seen in the community outside of your role at the institution, but being able to carry that messaging across in whatever you're doing as a representative of the institution.
Thank you. And Coral?
I think being able to really live your ethics of sustaining relationships is really critical. We had a great insight when myself and our director of admissions were working with a cohort of folks on supporting First Nation Indigenous scholars to enter higher ed, and one of the really insightful things that came out of our conversations was spend 2 years at the Haudenosaunee Onondaga reservation. Just go to events at the Onondaga Nation. Don't bring any pamphlets or flyers. Just show up. Just be present. Build those relationships first. Do that for 2 years. Do it for 3, and then offer something. And I think that those sustained dialogues oftentimes are the most revealing when people can become honest. We maintained sustained dialogues here in Geneva for a number of years. And I remember, I'll never forget this moment where we were facilitating this really powerful conversation between students, faculty, staff, long-term residents around a policy issue that was really important to the community. And we had done a lot of trust building to get to the point where we felt like we had the permission to be advocates and to use the privilege that we had as an institution. And I had said something while I was facilitating the dialogue, like it's been really powerful to hear people's voices today and hear the power that people have. And someone laughed and said, "Power, you have all the power. You're Hobart and William Smith." And he didn't say you work for Hobart and William Smith. He said you are, right? As though my identity, my privilege is something I can carry anywhere in the community. And as challenging as those things can be to hear, they're so important because they're the first step in true relationship, where people can really bear witness to how they see each other. We can get over the niceties and politeness that comes from grand, kind of ovations of appreciation because we built a community garden or a park or created service learning opportunities. Let's really get to it. Let's look at the real structural inequalities, pay inequity, employment opportunities, how many scholarships go to our young people within the community to go to Hobart William Smith. Let's really look at those things and look at where we're complicit and where we're having a real chance at creating new opportunity. And I think that for me, it's also about showing the receipts, being able to point to the strategic diversity plan and saying that we have built in economic opportunity as one of our measures for whether or not we're actually an inclusive community, and where we vend from, where we employ from, the ways in which we build small business owners here in the community. That's got to be a measure as much as it is to draw in a more diverse student body. It's about, again, I guess, receiving without being defensive and really retaining through all of the ups and downs those relationships to let people know I am not going anywhere. I'm going to keep coming back, and I am going to stay in relationship with you for years. That does matter. And I think ultimately change is what is required. Equity looks different. Resources are allocated differently. And that is simply where we must get to.
Thank you, friends. Now, I'm going to,
Hey,
if you,
Elijah,
yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry, you got to switch over to the next one?
No,
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
and I was gonna ask a follow-up question, if you want to indulge me. So you all talked about like how you navigate creating that sense of connection, that sense of trust in the community. So my question or follow-up question is like, you're probably familiar with the phrase, not all skin folk are your kinfolk. So how would you navigate this work in building trust if the community that you are a part of doesn't trust you? So in the sense that how are you navigating a sense of distrust or unifying? Because oftentimes as a diversity officer, folks can only see us in our position and not the person that is in the role. So how do you navigate or unify within your own communities at the intersections and at the margins where they don't trust you? And that's supposed to be your community.
Well, I guess I'll start. I'll say one of the first things that I try to do is to not show up in my identity as a diversity officer. Just show up. Show up and be a part of the discussion. And at some point in time, that may come up through conversation, but it's not what I would lead with. And I don't think that that's important to the folks in the community, what your title is at the time. the most important thing is whether or not what you're offering or you're presenting is truthful and authentic and something of support to the individuals that you're talking to. And I often have to say that to folks around me. We'll be having a conversation with someone and someone will walk in and they'll be like, yeah, and that's Dr. Gant. I'm like, please don't do that. Please don't do that. I don't need you to create my identity for me. Allow me to create my own identity within this space and how I want to navigate this space. And sometimes people were like, well, you earned that. I know I earned that. But so then that means I should also be able to own when I use that, since I earned that, and not have you navigate that for me. So it's a little bit of a dance and a balancing act. And I think again, once people see that you're there for the right reason, and you're not just there as a used car salesperson, or whatever it is you're coming to sell, I think that you build a little bit better rapport when you're able to do that. At least that's what I've found.
Thank you. Yeah, you had me when you said that, like when folks just throw out your title or your position before you, like, stop taking away my agency. Like, allow me the agency to be my whole self and choose how I want to show up versus you creating, to me, like that bias, because that's also going to anchor how that person is going to view me or interact with me by virtue of how you just laid it out for them. So yes, thank you.
Exactly.
Other panelists?
I think Calvin covered it for me. It's so funny that you use that because that happens to me all the time. I like to go into spaces as Tamika, and there are still people who sometimes when they see or they'll see an email from me or something like, oh my goodness, I didn't know you were a doctor, and it's like, yes, but I want to interact with you as Tamika, not you thinking I'm coming into the conversation as this other person. So that I can appreciate and relate to. But I think really it's just really continuing to have conversations and trying to be in all the spaces. So when there's programs, when there's events, when there's roundtable discussions happening, making sure you're there and you are your true authentic self, because people can tell when you're coming into a space or a conversation, and you're not being who you genuinely are. And that's where I think the distrust begins to happen.
I can't add anything. The only anecdote I'll offer is I had an experience a few months ago where I was on a call with a student caucus. It was different culture clubs, and it was going really well. And then a student asked me, why should we trust you? You're an administrator. And then they quoted something from Angela Davis about diversity officers, and my first reaction, like I can feel my defenses going up. Like, well, a careful reading of Angela Davis shows that's not what she said, or I was a student activist, or, oh, really? You're going to pick on the one administrator of color in your life, right? All those sort of defenses. But I think once we let that sort of defense parade pass us by for a second, just take a breath and just be present with what's really going on, which is that we're agents of change, and we participate in institutions that are violent in the lives of people, and that those are both true, and that part is not personal. And then we can go back to the relationships and sustaining those relationships with humility, curiosity, and partnership, and just the great opportunity we've been given to actually heal, to create community. What an extraordinary thing we get up and do every day. What a gift.
Herb, you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I'm sorry for almost cutting you off earlier. I wanted to make sure we heard from you, because I would say, since I met you, you've been one of the most clever, intelligent folks who answered some of these questions. But and there's one specific question I just wanted to ask, and I'd love to hear you answer or anybody else. But and this is a raw question. It just came up today as all of us were talking. But so I heard pretty much the majority of us said that a way to address privilege is to be a part of the community, kind of building that trust from just being there. And so And I'm speaking specifically from a Black lens when I ask this question. And before I get into the question, let me just give a disclaimer. Black is in so many different spaces. We do so many different things. There's not one single narrative or story to that, but I'm speaking to my own personal experience. And so being from Detroit, Michigan, I was always amazed at the difference when I was at here in Rochester and at Roberts Wesleyan College and at U of R and at RIT. But then I went home to Detroit, and in that space and in my neighborhood and the culture there, which is really urban, and for lack of a better term, like a street culture. Like that's a different type of environment there, right? And I remember, for instance, in 2014, around Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, when I saw those protests, people from that experience were there. If you fast forward to now, and I looked at George Floyd and some of the things happening in this recent era, if I'm being honest, when I was out there, me and one of my friends were talking, we grew up in the same neighborhood. We made an observation that the majority of folks who were out there were in spaces that us on this call exist in, or they were white and weren't from that narrative. So I guess my question would be, how can we really get to the heart of people who are within that culture, right? The urban experience, the street culture experience, because those are the people who are really majority of times affected by some of these things that are happening. So how can we build some of the trust there to maybe address some of the privilege they're seeing in us, you know?
Part of that is what we define as trust. So for me, I think about it in like a business, like not even a business side, but like my definition of trust is a balance of being reliable and being delightful. You can't be too reliable, can't be unreliable, can't be undelightful, can't be too delightful, but a balance. So if that were the definition, how are we creating spaces where we are both delightful and reliable to those communities we want to have a voice or to have agency? Now, if we're not doing that, we got to figure out why. And a lot of the times is that we don't create a space for folks to have agency. So like in trauma care and background, is like one of the things they teach you in counseling and coaching is that sometimes for folks to heal, their pain needs a witness. How do we create space where we can witness that pain, like experiencing the gamut of emotions, where you can go from angry to happy, you can have shame, and it's all embraced in a way that there's no disconnect. I think that's where we have to figure out a way, is where a lot of the times that the people that we want to be there on the front lines are done. They're tired. And they're rightfully so to be tired, because I get tired all the time. And I think we have to allow them to have some grace, is that like, it's okay to be tired. And a lot of times, like, if you're not whole enough, if sometimes we're navigating our activism and allyship around this from broken spaces. Like if we're leading from a lens of brokenness, what good are we? If we're advocating from a lens of brokenness, what good are we? So I would rather have you not be there because you're broken than show up broken. I think we need to figure out, how do we create spaces for our community members where we are getting to spaces of healing and not coping with our trauma. We thrive in our trauma. We have allegiance to our trauma, and it prevents us from being our whole selves. So we got to figure out a way where, how do we create that entry point? And then what I'm talking about, I have to own that what I'm talking about right now is privilege. Like a lot of folks don't have the ways to verbalize what I just said. They don't know what to say. They don't know that, oh, I didn't know I was coping. I thought I was healing. So how do we even build capacity around self-awareness? And then what does it really mean to be an ally? Sometimes being an ally is just being still, and allow the folks who have the energy and the emotional capacity to unpack. And then when you get that energy, you can be like, tag me in.
Love that. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. That's why I went to go on to the next one without saying something.
And I
But-
don't think you know, and that's one of the things I think that comes along with coming into a situation with privilege. Because we've gone through the experiences that we've gone through, and education in and of itself is an experience, a tactical learning experience, right? And so if we walk into those spaces with that same tactical experience that we learned in terms of coping with getting through our educational experience, then we're already done. We're already done. Because you know, the way I might want to approach a conversation with someone is when you say to me you're from the street, I want to ask the question, did you choose the street or did the street choose you? Have you ever like stopped and thought about who decided where you are going to be in your development? Now, that doesn't mean I'm coming to you and saying I expect you to have to go to college. No, they don't want to hear all of that. But I want you to have a quality of life that you own, you have ownership of, as opposed to you have to report to this person who actually is the person who's making the money from what you're trying to do. And you're trying, you know, it's that level of conversation and understanding. But again, we don't take time enough to stop and have those conversations, those deep conversations. And it's going to be uncomfortable because there's going to be stuff that comes up that they say that you're not going to be comfortable with because it's not your personal, that's not your style, that's not who you are. But in order to move forward, you have to sit with that uncomfortableness and be with them and go through that. Um, it's not an easy walk. It's certainly not an easy walk. Like I said, you know, even in working with kids in higher ed, right? They walk into the door, they're a very different person than what they are when they leave you 4 years, 2 years, however many years down the line. They're very, very different personalities. And you got to work with them from where they started to where they are going to go. And that's the part that sometimes people want to put them on a train. And it's like, no. They have to move at the pace that's best for them. And sometimes that even means they have to leave this experience.
Yeah. And no, thank you. And really good thoughts. I want to say in our time over these last few months being on Zoom, I've learned I got to say something face, and I think Coram got the hey, I got something to say face. I think you had some stewing up there.
You're good. I mean, I think I just really resonated with the educational conversation because I do think we have to rethink sometimes what the educational privilege is that we're getting and what the educational deficit is that we're getting. When we enclose education, we are actually losing the transformative capacity of education. The more we make it an object to deny some, the more it actually loses its veracity and its essence. You know, always remember W. Du Bois, right? To educate, educare, to draw out human power. And, you know, Zoom created this wonderful opportunity for us here in our community where we had a lot of young people working to change a lot of the policies around police accountability. And, you know, they had been organizing mass protests. And there was a public notice that went out that said, you know, these students or these young people, excuse me, are going to be out. We have to be careful. If you really care about George Floyd, please, everyone stay at home. We don't want any violence. And all of a sudden we had folks out on their porches with shotguns, you know, protecting their stores from these young people that were peacefully protesting. And we saw an educational opportunity. Right. These were young people that were being denied even the voice of their intent, even the methodology they were using. So why don't we conduct some teach-ins to inform and let's do it together. Let's co-teach. Let's rethink what it means to co-teach. What can't I learn, right, from an activist, right? What can't that activist learn from an Africana Studies scholar? Right. And why don't we come together? And so we started this series. We ended up getting at times 200-300 people on these Zoom calls. And it became such a sort of an unsettling thing, because we were countering the narratives about these folks, right? But we were also transforming ourselves. We started to rethink, what are we doing with our time in the classroom? Right? Why can't we restructure our courses so that we can be more involved? I think that's where administrators can play a key role when they're steeped in a real commitment to transformative education, is to say, how do we use the education? Because I do believe that is our greatest power. I believe that our greatest power is to draw in education. And I saw that people saw that as a political threat. You know, all of a sudden the president's getting all these letters, I'm getting all these letters, and all we were doing was educating the community. Right, that's all we were doing. But educating the community, that's gotten people killed, right? And certainly educating the community is one of the most dangerous and important and loving things that we can do. And so I was just reacting when Calvin was talking about education, because we have to rethink. We have to rethink who the educators are, and who the students are, and how we educate. And I do think that this COVID era has given us a unique opportunity to do just that.
Tamika, anything to add to those points?
I was just gonna say, as I was listening, talking and thinking about some of the things that Olajuwon said, sometimes we have to make sure that the people who are out on the front lines, or the allies, aren't performative allies, that we're moving them out of the way so that the real work can really start to happen. I also think that as educators, sometimes for us and administrators, we can forget who we really are, or where we came from. So we think that having these conversations, or trying to reach certain groups, are difficult, but it's difficult because you forgot that maybe you were in the same space that they are in. So sometimes you have to bring yourself back and recenter yourself and remember who you are and where you came from. And it makes those conversations and you connecting with different groups much easier.
Yeah, no, love that. Thank you. And I really appreciate you all answering that, because I think, especially for me, when I walk into some of the spaces and we had these conversations, and we see ourselves as woke, we walk into rooms and I see other folks who are woke as well. And I often find myself thinking, what about the folks who may not be in that space? And sometimes we don't talk about how to be able to navigate that, or why it's okay that they're not in that space. And so I thought it would have been a missed opportunity to not talk about that, because I know there are people on this call who are surely dealing with that, and I appreciate how you articulated that. So
I just wanted to boost that point, and also just say that this is, for our students, such a developmentally important thing, because so much of how they're presenting their ethics is on social media. And so social media is inherently performative, but it becomes very transactional. If you say the right things, you get the right points. And that can't be what we're here for. We're here for transformation, not for transaction. And I just really appreciated, Tamika's point, because we do need to call students in. We're all growing here. We're all learning here. We are all waking up every day, which means we're all a little bit asleep every day.
I think, and would love to hone in for folks that are on the call, is that if you're using this woke language as part of your vocabulary, you can remove it if you want. So, because a lot of you conflate being woke with being the product and not the process. It's cool to be awake, but are you conscientious? What are you doing with being awake and being aware? If there's no action tied to your awareness, then there's no point in labeling yourself as woke. So I'll leave that there as we go to our next component of action items.
once again, appreciate the conversation and that. For the folks out there, I want y'all to know that was not planned. We freestyled that right there. It was a freestyle. And it came out well, but hopefully people got a lot from that. I know I did, and I'm sure all the other panelists did as well. So just some context to this last piece about the actions. We talked about the pain, the privilege. Now, what are some action steps we can do? So the goal of today is to both educate and inspire to action. I love how a lot of them just captured that at the end of his last statement there, because it is really I think when action is always the most probable when action is always most probable when the action is needed, and the action needed is clear and direct. So just to summarize that, when we know exactly what we need to do and there's clarity, you have a clear vision on where you need to go and it's direct, action can happen. And so the question with that is, what steps can both individuals on this call and the individuals who may represent their organizations take to implement these intersectional and inclusive insights that you have provided today? And so just in the spirit, we got a lot of questions come in. So in the spirit of time, we can do this as a speed round where we can take a minute, give some action steps for folks, and then we'll jump into the Q&A because I see we got 13 questions, which is really good. And I want to make sure we have time to get to all those. So Cormac, we can start with you with just some speed round, some action items, and then we'll go to Calvin, and then we go to Tamika. And Elijah, will be good for the audience after that? Okay.
All right, I'll try to be quick. Who's not in the room, bring them in the room, right? So, what is the room? So I think those are some of the first questions, right? That came up a lot, I think, in the conversation about community, right? Do you have, if it's a committee or a board or advising, where are you getting that advice from? Who's in committee? Who's in council with you? Does it include students? Does it include long-term residents? Does it include hourly wage workers? Have you had an opportunity to get critical insight, right, at some point? And are you overstacking underrepresented voices in that work? So I think wherever we're working, whatever office is, if it's a division or department or a single program, that's the first place that I would begin, is to look at the bias of where we're even going to drive our recommendations from. And that will do a lot of the grounding work. Remember, we were talking about humility. It comes from the Greek, like humus, which just means earth. It just means coming down to earth, right? So flatten out your process of collecting data and information about the problem and make sure everybody can get to you. So I'll leave it with that as I think a critical starting point. And then I could sit at Tamika and Calvin's feet because they've been doing this long enough for me to learn.
So, I definitely have a platform thought on this, so forgive me for my platform. One of the things that I think we need to be doing more of is we do not, from an institutional standpoint, touch our CSEA and cleaning folks on our campus. We do not create a space for equity when it comes to those who do not have access to a higher education. So that is on us as the people at the institution to create better opportunities for development for those individuals within our institution. So that is one point of order. The second thing is we need to go back and start reviewing all of our policies and procedures and look at the language that we use that either invites or disinvites people to our spaces, starting from the admissions application all the way through, applying to be in the honors program at your institution. Have criteria been established that purposefully, conscious or unconscious, create inequities for those who are eligible for those spaces and opportunities? So I think that it's incumbent upon us all to be responsible for doing that. Just recently, I did a session with adjunct faculty. I said, go back and look at your syllabus and look at whether or not the words in your syllabus create a place for students to know that you're welcoming and you want them to engage, or does your syllabus tell them that engaging with you is not to their benefit, and so therefore they will not seek you out? So I think it's incumbent upon us all to take on responsibility for doing that.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's already been said. What I would also say is, as people doing diversity work, we have to make sure that we're not just invited to the table or invited to the conversation. We have to have a seat at the table. Sometimes you have to demand that seat at the table. Sometimes you got to bring your own chair to the table and say, actually, no, I'm gonna go ahead and sit here because I deserve this spot. And if you want to hear what I have to say, and the only way we can move the needle and to make change is if I'm a part of the table. and sitting around it, not just coming in when you want to hear about, what did you learn from this panel? No, how can I sit here and talk to you and work with you to implement the things that I heard on the panel? So I think for me, that's the most important thing, because we can share things, we can learn things, we can go to trainings, we can be in different groups and have conversations. But if what we learn and take back isn't valued and we aren't given the opportunity to be in the room where it happens and those conversations and decisions are made, then what was it for?
Amen. Dropping the mic right there. Good. Okay. Elijah, we gotta first can we just give I know we can't hear or see y'all out there. We're gonna give a round of applause to our panelists for just that really insightful, inclusive and insightful conversation. We appreciate that. And so now we want to transition into the Q&A section, so we can get some answers to some of the questions that you all have asked. We got a lot of questions in here, which is great. Appreciate the participation. And so Elijah, if you want to just kick us off with our first question in the Q&A, we can maybe just scroll through.
Yep, sure. So first question, friends, someone asked, based on this definition, which is probably alluding to the first couple of slides, is being woke the same thing as being culturally humble? I will, in my opinion, no. I think being woke is a state of being, versus being culturally humble is a state of knowing. So like, because you can be woke, but do you know what it means to be woke? So, because cultural humility is talking about is a lifelong process of self-critique and self-reflection and how you show up in the world and how you react to it. Being woke doesn't require that. It just requires you to be aware. It doesn't require you to act or critique yourself. Often being woke is you critiquing others other than yourself. So I would say that they are not the same. And I invite the panelists, I see the nods, agree, so.
Period, end of sentence.
Good. Okay.
The next question, that I'm looking at wasn't really a comment, so I'm not gonna, do you want me to read the comment? So the first two is not questions, comment.
Elijah, if I might, there's one question here I want to ask, and I think it's 3 or 4 people asked a similar one. So can I read this one off? Because I think it
Go
really
right ahead.
helps. This was actually for Calvin. I think it was speaking to what you were saying, and other folks can jump in here, but I think it's a really good question. And so she started off by saying, first, thank you for your candor and saying you were not okay. And the added burden of not being asked and having to navigate that. So she appreciated you, just the vulnerability, Scrum talked about earlier, of doing that. But had this thought, and I think this is a good one. I'll let her hear answers from the panelists here. They've also seen the opposite indication from another source. So there's a list of helpful things to do and not do for your Black friends. And one of them was stop asking your Black friend if they are okay. And then the lens from this was, one, because you can't handle the truth of that answer, right? And what comes with that. And then secondly, you may not have earned the intimacy to ask that. And so she's really just going to get at what's the tension behind that, and is there a real answer to that?
Well, I think in even asking the question, she's answered part of the question. So I'm going to say, if you came to me as an individual and said, listen, Calvin, I know at this point in time, I may not have the intimacy or relationship with you to be able to engage in some of these difficult conversations, but I have an interest in knowing more about X, Y, and Z, or I just really want to check in and make sure that you're okay. You're putting it out there that you know that you may not have the relationship for us to be able to get into that deeper. But I'm going to have more respect for the fact that you did that self-analysis first and didn't expect me to have self is hard work. And it requires compassion, it requires empathy, but it also requires a lot of support. And so I just ask that all of the folks that are on the call be mindful of the fact that, those that come into this work come into it for a love of being there and helping the underdog. And that's sometimes very thankless work. And many times it's not well paid work. Um, I'm not gonna say that MCC, y'all pay me, so I'm not talking about y'all. But in many cases, people are doing the work and the compensation for the work that happens outside of the office continues. And you know, they need to know that the work has meaning and that people see that that work is meaningful, and to be there and support as allies throughout, not only when times are hard, but when times are really good. We need to see those same allies show up. So that would be my message.
And mine would be to the people on the call that are already doing the work, to make sure that you are taking care of yourself, that you find time for yourself, that you reclaim your time when someone is trying to monopolize on it, and that you make sure that there are going to be times when people want you to come and have conversations and share your knowledge, and help them impact change. And it's okay to ask for them to pay you to do that when it is above and beyond and outside of your job. Because so many times for the work that we do, people will try to monopolize on that. And they will always want to ask you to do something and to do it for free. Well, it's okay to say no. Um, and definitely during these times, it's okay to just step away, take time for yourself, and just know that everybody can't always be in the forefront of every movement, of every fight. There are many different roles that you can play. And sometimes it's time to sit down, rest, rejuvenate, and let somebody else stand in the forefront.
Thank you, Calvin. Thank you, Tamika. I don't think I can say more than what you all have said. So I'm actually going to just read from this wonderful. I highly recommend this to everyone, especially given the woke conversation today. And this is a powerful anecdote to that, by Adrienne Maree Brown. We are seeding the future, including our next systems of justice, with every action we take. The fractal nature of our sacred design teaches us that our smallest choices today will become our next norms. And I just want to remind myself of that, because whether it's taking a break or passing the torch to someone else, or just doing the work of showing up tonight and taking at least one thing away that we can build out from, that's part of it. Everything, as Lauryn Hill says, is everything. And we absolutely can take everything that was talked about tonight and take one piece of it, each of us. We're all part of the grand design. We're all part of the play that's going to make this work. This is transformative work. And at times it can feel slow and like it's not going anywhere. But the fact that there's still 48 people on this call after 2 hours means that we are moving. This work is moving and we are part of a movement. So thank you all for reminding me of that. And thank you for letting me be a part of community tonight as we talk about this work.
Yeah, and I would just end with, before Pastor Elijah want to close this out, I would just end with, first, on behalf of Roberts, we appreciate this being just set up and available, and just the things that we have learned. And I know just from the information I have gathered here today, I'll be able to take that back and implement that, and people will be affected positively by that. But the last thing I want to leave is for the people who are still on the call, who have privilege and power in their organizations to influence the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that right now it is a socially cool and acceptable thing to be on board with DE&I, and some of the symbolic things that people are doing are amazing. For many of us, it feels performative, and it might be, but the real change comes in the systemic things, and the systemic oftentimes is tied to resources and also financial resources. And we're going to be committed to that. Commitment without cash is counterfeit. So we have to really put our money where our mouth is, and back these things so that we can actually see real change. Because like Calvin said, for these positions, a lot of times they're underpaid and under resourced and understaffed to be able to execute at a high level, but also have high expectations. So if you're on the call and you have that privilege and access to do that, and to provide some resources, I encourage you to do that.
And I would say just think on behalf of Nazareth, but also for those still on the call, friends, look forward to many more of these conversations. So there'll be more intersectional inclusive insights with our monthly offerings. But I also wanted to close out by, my last little tidbits were like, that if those who are on the call is that I want you to understand that you choose how you want to vibrate. So you ever have that, like that notion of vibrating higher, like do not magnetize yourself to negative energy. So I tell myself when I do this work is that the more you know yourself, the more, power you have. And the more power you have within yourself, the least influence it may have due to the hatred, the ignorance, or distrust of others. So if you allow that energy to take hold, it can have a sort of a negative outlook. But part of that is understanding that as diversity officers, we don't really want you to figuratively lock arms with us. I'd rather you lock in spirit and in mind. I rather we are unified in our hearts to change our minds about how we show up. So because it's more than just standing in the fight. It's remaining there once the dust has settled. And how are we going to replenish the scorched earth after the battle? That's where the real work begins. And we thank you all for being a part of our conversation and dialogue, and ask that you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm just grateful. I appreciate this. This was good.
Yeah, same here. This is always like the awkward part. It's like some people leaving out, some people staying to see what's gonna be like behind the scenes, like a Marvel movie. We get that extra, that extra little bit on there.
That inside.
This is where the bloopers come in, right? Yeah.
What's gonna happen after? What's the conversation after dark?
All right, so what's going on in there? Nah, we ain't got nothing left for y'all. Y'all can go ahead and get out of here.
Did you start having a follow-up conversation?
Yeah, so Calvin couldn't be there. If y'all still cool, I'll send out the Zoom invite. I'll log out of here and then send out an invite just so we can be brief for 10, 15 minutes,
Okay.
for the next group of folks who go.
Okay.
All right, cool. So I'll send that out and appreciate y'all again. I'll see y'all in a couple minutes and thank you to everybody else who's logging off right now.
Okay.
Take
All
care.
right.